Every Saturday morning, before the mist had lifted off the grain fields, Stella Vance walked the same half-mile of packed dirt road into Cartwright, Manitoba, and set up her table at the far end of the market square. Third stall from the corner, under the crooked elm that had lost its largest branch in the ice storm of 1889. She had been doing it for 14 months. Long enough that people stopped noticing her. Long enough that she had stopped noticing herself. The table held jars of preserves, Saskatoon berry, chokecherry, crabapple, and bundles of dried lavender that she grew in the narrow strip of south-facing soil behind the boarding house where she rented a room from Mrs. Holt. The lavender had been her mother's idea once, in a different life. Stella had carried the seeds west in a handkerchief, tucked into her coat pocket, and planted them the first spring after the funeral. Not because she believed they would grow, but because she needed something to do with her hands on the days when stillness felt like drowning. They grew. They always grew. Her mother had said lavender was stubborn that way. She was arranging the jars, label out no gaps, when she became aware that someone was standing at the edge of her stall. She looked up. The man was broad-shouldered and stood with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to conserve effort over a long time spent outdoors. His coat was clean, but worn at the elbows. His hat was pushed back slightly, and his face. She noticed this before she noticed anything else, was the color of old cedar, weathered and creased at the corners of the eyes in a way that spoke of years spent squinting into a prairie sky. He was holding a jar of chokecherry preserves and studying the label with the same concentrated attention one might give a legal document. He did not look up. "Those are this year's batch," Stella said. "Better than last year's. I let them cook longer." He set the jar down with care and met her eyes briefly. His were gray, the particular gray of the sky before snow. "Miss," he said. He placed coins on the table, the exact amount she noticed, without having asked the price, picked up the jar and walked away. She watched him cross the square, load the jar into the back of a farm wagon, and drive north on the Portage Road without looking back. She didn't know his name. She didn't ask. He came back the following Saturday. Same time, same coat. He walked directly to her stall, studied the jars for a moment, selected the crabapple this time, placed coins on the table. Exact change again. She had begun to suspect he checked her prices the week before, and said only, "Miss," in that same flat, careful tone before he left. It went on like that through October and into November. Saskatoon one week, chokecherry the next. He never bought more than one jar. He never lingered. He never said anything beyond that single word of acknowledgement, and once or twice, when she tried to start a conversation, cold morning. "I have dried apple too, if you're interested." He answered in monosyllables that were not quite rude, but were not quite open either. His name, she eventually learned from Mrs. Holt, was Emmett Crail. He ran the quarter section north of town that had belonged to his father and his father's father. Cattle, mostly, and some winter wheat. He had come back to Manitoba from somewhere out west 7 or 8 years ago. Nobody was entirely sure of the story, and had kept mostly to himself since. "Not unfriendly," Mrs. Holt said, refilling Stella's tea without being asked. "Just particular. Doesn't waste words. Some men are like that. They save them up for something important." Stella looked at her tea. She thought about the exact change, left without discussion. She thought about how his eyes moved to the jars before they moved to her, careful and deliberate, as if he had already decided what he needed before he arrived. She wondered if that was true of everything in his life, or only the preserves. She told herself she was not wondering about Emmett Crail. The market moved indoors in December, into the grain exchange on Bishop Street, because the temperature, had dropped to the kind of cold that made your breath crack, and the metal legs of Stella's table seize up and refuse to fold properly. The indoor space was close and warm, and smelled of sawdust and coffee from the pot that old Mr. Fenwick kept going on the pot-belly stove in the corner. People crowded in and talked too loudly, and the stalls were pressed together so that Stella found herself elbow to elbow with the woman next to her selling beeswax candles. The first Saturday in December, she almost didn't recognize him. He was in the same coat but without the hat, and something about seeing his hair, dark, shot through with gray at the temples, made him look briefly like a stranger. He stood at the edge of the room for a moment, scanning, and she had the odd sensation of being the thing he was scanning for. He found her stall. He came directly across the room, sidestepping two children running between the tables, and stopped in front of the jars. There was no room for the usual silence. The woman with the candles was telling someone about her sister's wedding. A man behind Stella was arguing cheerfully about wheat prices. The noise pressed in from all sides, and Emmett Crale stood in the middle of it and picked up a jar of crabapple and turned it in his hands and said, without looking up, "You moved the label higher." Stella stared at him. "I did," she said after a moment. The old placement was covering the fruit in the glass. "I thought it looked better." He looked up then, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the possibility of one. "It does," he said. He put the jar down. He picked up another one. He did not leave. "I haven't seen dried lavender," he said. "I sold out in October. I'll have more next summer." "Your mother's recipe," he said. She went very still. "What?" He nodded toward a handwritten card she had placed at the corner of the table, the one that said lavender from seed, grown in Cartwright since 1890, our family recipe. She had written our without thinking, and it had been true once, and she had not been able to make herself change it. "I'm sorry," he said, with an abruptness that she suspected meant he'd just realized he'd overstepped. "I read the card." "No," she said. "It's fine." She straightened a jar that didn't need straightening. She died in the spring of '89. "In Winnipeg. I came here after." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind picked up and rattled the grain exchange windows. "I'm sorry," he said again, and this time it was not abrupt at all. It was the kind of thing you said when you meant it precisely, and no more and no less. She looked at him. He was already looking at her. She felt heat climb the back of her neck and was grateful for the warm, crowded room that made it unremarkable. "Emmett Crale," he said, and offered his hand. "Stella Vance," she said, and shook it. His hand was very warm and very rough, and he held her hand for exactly the right amount of time before he released it. He bought 2 jars that Saturday. It was the first time he had ever bought 2. In January, a hardware merchant named Douglas Pell arrived in Cartwright and set up shop on the east end of Bishop Street. And on his second Saturday in town, he appeared at Stella's stall with the easy confidence of a man who was comfortable talking to strangers. He was 35 or thereabouts, with a trimmed beard and a good coat, and the kind of smile that arrived quickly and left slowly. He bought a jar of Saskatoon and told her about his shop in Brandon before this, and the one before that in Regina, and asked where she had come from and how long she had been in Cartwright, and listened to her answers with the attentiveness of a man who had learned that women liked to be listened to. He came back the following Saturday with the same smile and a sharper set of questions, and by the 3rd week he was bringing coffee from Fenwick's pot and handing it to her while she sat up, and the woman with the beeswax candles watched this and raised her eyebrows at Stella in a way that Stella chose not to acknowledge. Emmett Crale arrived, as always, at the same time as before. He stopped at the edge of the stall, took in the scene. Douglas Pell, leaning on the edge of the table, coffee in hand, mid-sentence, and Stella looked up and met Emmett's eyes for a brief moment before he looked away. He stood there a moment more, then bought a jar of chokecherry without speaking, and left earlier than usual. She noticed. She told herself it meant nothing. But she also noticed that Douglas Pell, for all his easy manner, had never once asked about the label on the card. He had never noticed the change in the lavender placement. He smiled at her the way he probably smiled at most things, broadly, and without much cost. And she didn't doubt his pleasantness. She just found, when she tried to place his face later in the day, that it slid away from her memory, like water off oilcloth. Emmett Crail's face did not do that. February came in hard. There was a week when the temperature dropped low enough that the grain exchange closed early, and Stella stayed in her room at Mrs. Holt's with the counterpane pulled up and a lamp going, and a letter from her cousin in Ontario, half written on the desk, waiting for something she wanted to say and couldn't find. Her cousin wanted her to come east. There was a position, companion to an elderly woman, in Guelph, respectable work, a warm house. You have been on your own long enough, her cousin wrote. You can't sell preserves in Manitoba forever, Stella. She reread the letter 3 times and didn't write back. The Saturday the market reopened. The cold had eased just enough for people to be grateful, and the grain exchange was fuller than usual because people had been cooped up and needed the movement. Stella had finished setting up and was tying her apron strings when she heard Douglas Pell's voice somewhere behind her. Too loud in the way that carried, saying to someone, "I'll ask her today, I've decided." She did not turn around. She arranged the front jar so the label faced exactly outward. Emmett Crail arrived at his usual time. He walked to her stall and stopped and looked at the jars, and she was aware, acutely aware, of Douglas Pell making his way across the room toward her from the opposite direction. "Mr. Crail," she said, with a peculiar urgency she did not fully understand. He looked up. Something in her face must have shown him something, because he looked at her steadily, without speaking, waiting. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice lower than she intended. "I'll have lavender again in June. I was going to bring some by the farm, if that would suit you. I don't always manage to have enough left by Saturday." It was not a clever thing to say. It was barely a true thing to say. She had made no such plan, had barely had time to think of one. But he looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in that gray gaze, something careful and considered. And he said, "That would suit me fine, Miss Vance," in a voice that was even quieter than usual, and she thought she had never in her life been so grateful for someone's willingness to accept the surface of a thing. Douglas Pell arrived at her stall a moment later, smiled, and opened his mouth. "I'm afraid I was just in the middle of arranging something," Stella said pleasantly. "But thank you for stopping by, Mr. Pell." He went. He was gracious about it. She gave him full credit for that. Emmett Crail stood at her stall for 6 minutes after that. She counted, because she had nothing else to do with her attention, and he looked at the jars, and he did not say much, but when he finally left, he looked back once briefly, from the door of the grain exchange. She was already looking. She glanced down immediately at a jar that did not need rearranging. March, April. The ground softened, and the roads turned to mud, and the market moved back outdoors, back to the square, back to the crooked elm with its missing branch. Stella replanted the lavender bed, and thinned the crabapple seedlings, and did not receive another letter from her cousin which she chose to interpret as permission. She told herself she was staying because Cartwright suited her. The boarding house was comfortable. Mrs. Holt was kind, and the market had been good to her. She told herself that was the whole of it. She did not examine the rest of it too closely. In April, the Crail farm had a difficult week. 2 cows down with a fever, and Emmett drove into town on a Wednesday for the veterinary and came past the market square, which was not yet set up for Saturday, and saw Stella carrying a crate of jars toward the storage shed that Mr. Fenwick let her use. He stopped the wagon. "Miss Vance," he said. "Mr. Crail." She shifted the crate. It was heavier than she had calculated. He got down from the wagon without saying anything further and took the crate from her in one motion, so smoothly and naturally that she did not have time to protest. He carried it to the shed. He set it inside carefully, label side up, which she noticed. "Thank you," she said. He said, which was apparently all he had for that. He went back to the wagon. She watched him climb up. He collected the reins and then, without looking at her, he said, "The lavender." "June," she said. "I said June. I know." A pause. "I'll be there." He drove north on the Portage Road. She stood in the mud outside the storage shed with her empty hands and the April wind cutting right through her coat, and thought very clearly, "Oh, June came the way. June always comes to Manitoba." Suddenly, brilliantly, as if winter had simply changed its mind overnight and decided to be done with the whole affair. The fields went green in a week. The lilacs came out along the Portage Road, so thick you could smell them from the wagon. Stella cut the lavender on a Friday morning, bundles of it, tied with the gray string she always used, and packed them in the flat crate she used for market, and harnessed the old mare she rented from the livery, and drove north. She told herself she was doing this for practical reasons. She told herself she had already told him June. She told herself the road was easy, and the morning was fine, and there was nothing extraordinary about delivering lavender to a farm. She turned in at the gate with the wooden sign, Crail, painted in plain black letters, and drove up the lane. The farmyard was tidy in the way that spoke of habit rather than pride. The fence posts straight, the barn door latched, the kitchen garden visible beyond the corner of the house, square and well tended. A border collie appeared from somewhere and escorted the wagon with enormous seriousness. Emmett Crail came out of the barn. He stopped when he saw the wagon. He looked at the crate in the back, and then at her on the seat, and something moved across his face that she had learned by now to read as surprise. It looked the same as his regular expression, but fractionally more open, like a window raised a single inch. "Miss Vance," he said. "Mr. Crail," she said. "I said June." He came to the wagon. He looked at the lavender. He reached in and picked up one of the bundles and turned it in his hands. The same deliberate attention he gave to everything, and he said without looking up, "You didn't need to drive out." "No," she agreed. "I would have come Saturday." "Yes," she said. "I know." He looked up at her then. She was still on the wagon seat, which put her at eye level with him, and the distance between them was nothing. A foot, maybe less. And she could see clearly the lines at the corners of his eyes and a small scar above his left brow she had never been close enough to notice before. He seemed to realize, all at once, that he was still holding the lavender. He looked at it. He looked at her. Something moved through his expression that was not quite embarrassment and not quite uncertainty. More like a man who had been very certain about one thing and had just discovered there was another thing entirely. "Miss Vance," he said carefully. "Would you?" He stopped. He tried again. "I was about to have coffee." It was possibly the least elegant invitation she had ever received in her life. "Yes," she said. "I would like that very much, Mr. Crail." She stayed 3 hours. They had coffee at the kitchen table, which was plain pine, scrubbed pale, with a single window that looked out over the kitchen garden and beyond it to the open field running north to the tree line. He made the coffee strong and did not apologize for it. She did not ask him to. They talked. She talked, mostly, at first because he seemed to need the warm-up of it, like an engine in cold weather, about the market. about the crabapple seedlings, about her mother's original recipe, and how she had modified it because the Manitoba choka cherries were more bitter than the Ontario ones she had grown up with. He listened with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on her face, and she had the distinct and not unpleasant sensation of being heard in full. He talked about the farm. Not easily, not with the fluency of someone who discussed it often, but with the slow precision of someone choosing the right words from a small and valued supply. The cows that had been sick. Better now, he said. Touch wood. The winter wheat had been decent. He was thinking about adding a second pasture, but the fencing cost was considerable. Your father's farm, she said. And his father's, he said. I grew up here, left for a while. He paused, came back. She did not ask about the leaving. She thought he might be grateful for that. Outside, the border collie was making a thorough investigation of something under the kitchen garden fence. The afternoon light fell long and gold across the pine table. The lavender, he said at last, into a comfortable silence. Yes, my mother used to dry it, he said. Hang it in the barn. She said it kept the horses calm. I don't know if that's true. A pause. It might be. He said it in the same flat, careful voice he used for everything, and it was only because she had been listening to that voice for 14 months that she understood what he was actually saying. That the smell of lavender was something he had carried from before, from a different time, from a kitchen where someone else stood, and that every Saturday, when he bought a jar from her table, it was not only about the preserves. She looked at her coffee cup. She looked at the kitchen garden through the window. She thought about seeds carried in a handkerchief. She thought about the letter from her cousin in Guelph, which she had still not answered. Mr. Crail, she said. Emmett, he said quietly, if you don't mind. She felt the words settle in the room like a stone into still water. Emmett, she said, I think I would like to come back next Friday, if that is agreeable to you. He was quiet for a moment. The border collie scratched at the kitchen door, and he got up and let it in without comment, and it settled under the table against his boots, as if it had always done this. I'll have the gate open, he said. She came back the following Friday, and the one after that, and the one after that. By August the gate was always open, when she turned in at the lane, and the coffee was always ready. And sometimes there was bread from the neighbor woman, 2 farms down, who had apparently been informed of the situation, and had opinions about it that she expressed through baked goods. Stella learned things. She learned that Emmett had gone west, to British Columbia, at 24, because of a woman who had not, in the end, wanted to live on a Manitoba farm, and that he had spent 6 years in the Okanagan and come home when his father died, and had not, as far as she could tell, allowed himself to want anything he couldn't be certain of since. She learned that he read history, mostly and occasionally the agricultural reports with the same thorough attention, and that he had an opinion about wheat varieties that he held with quiet conviction. She learned that when something amused him, it showed only in a slight deepening of the lines around his eyes and a barely audible sound in the back of his throat. That she had begun to anticipate with a disproportionate amount of pleasure. He learned things too, she knew. He learned how she took her coffee black, because she had stopped buying cream after her mother died and had never seen a reason to start again. And that she was most comfortable when she had something to do with her hands, which is why she had started helping weed the kitchen garden while they talked, a development that had arrived so naturally that neither of them had acknowledged it. He learned that she had a cousin in Ontario who wrote letters, and a former neighbor in Winnipeg who had promised to write but never had. He learned, she suspected, rather more about what the winters were like in a single room at Mrs. Holt's boarding house than she had intended to convey. In September, he asked if she would consider moving her lavender bed to the south field of the farm, where the soil would suit it better and the drainage was good. He said it in an offhand way, looking at the fence post he was fixing rather than at her, and the practical terms of it. More space, better conditions, a portion of the yield for herself to sell, were all perfectly sensible and entirely beside the point. She stood in the September light, with her hands in her coat pockets, and looked at the south field, and then at the back of his head. "That seems sensible," she said. "Good," he said, and went back to the fence post. October. The market was preparing to move indoors again. Cartwright had the familiar smell of impending winter, wood smoke, and cold earth, and something sharper underneath, the suggestion of the months ahead. Stella was at the market stall when Mrs. Holt's niece came past and said, in the forthright manner of someone delivering information that everyone else already knows, "I hear you've been spending Fridays out at the Crail farm." "Yes," Stella said. "People are talking," the niece said, not unkindly. "Are they saying anything useful?" Stella asked. The niece considered this. "Mrs. Mackay says it's about time. She says Emmett Crail has been alone out there long enough, and someone sensible ought to see to him." A pause. "I think that's the nicest thing she has ever said about anyone." Stella said nothing. She placed a jar of chokecherry on the table and aligned it with the others. "He brought wood to the boarding house," the niece added. "Last Tuesday. Left it round the back without knocking. Mrs. Holt says she didn't ask for it." Stella had not known that. She thought about it for the rest of the morning. At noon, Emmett arrived at the stall. He was later than usual. Saturdays he came in the morning, always. He looked as though he had hurried or decided something. He stood at the edge of the stall. He picked up a jar and put it down. He picked it up again. "Miss Vance," he said. "Emmett," she said, because they had been past Miss Vance and Mr. Crail for some weeks now when they were alone, and she was tired of being alone in that. He looked up. His jaw worked slightly, which she recognized as the expression of a man having a disagreement with himself about whether to say something. "The room at Mrs. Holt's," he said. She waited. "It'll be cold," he said. "This winter." She waited. The market noise went on around them, distant and warm. He put the jar down. He picked it up again. He said very quietly, "I am not good at this." "I know," she said. "I don't mind." Something in his face broke open. Not dramatically, not like weather, but like the ice on a pond in April, gradual and decisive at once. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him choosing words with the care he gave to everything. Fence posts, coffee, the exact change on a table. "Would you?" He stopped. He tried again, in the direct way that was, she understood, the only way he knew how to be. "I would like to call on you properly, Miss Vance, if you would permit it." He had slipped back to Miss Vance. She thought that was probably what he'd been practicing. "Stella," she said. A pause. "Stella." "Yes," she said. "I would like that very much." He called on her properly, with the formality that Cartwright expected, and that she found, to her surprise, that she did not mind at all. He brought her to the church social in November, and to the skating on the river in January. And the whole of Cartwright watched with what Mrs. Mackay called satisfaction, and what Mrs. Holt called about time, and Stella sitting in the church pew beside Ref. Emmett Crail on a February morning, while the snow came down outside the windows, and the congregation sang, and his arm pressed warm and solid against hers, thought that she had never felt less like a woman without a home in her life. She wrote to her cousin in Ontario in March. "I am staying in Cartwright," she wrote. "I have found, I think, that I am exactly where I am supposed to be." She posted it on a Saturday on her way to the market, the crooked elm and the morning light already familiar as her own hands. When she reached her stall, Third from the corner, as always, she found a jar of lavender sitting on the table, though she had not set it there herself. She did not have to look across the square to know where it had come from. She already knew he would be there. Standing by the wagon on the north side, hat in hand, the prairie lights slant and gold across the plains of his face. She looked anyway. He was watching her with the particular steadiness of a man who has decided what he needs and is no longer in any doubt about it. She raised her hand. He raised his. It was not a grand gesture. It was the smallest possible thing. But later, much later, in the house north of town, in the kitchen with the pine table and the window looking out over the lavender bed in full summer bloom. Her hands no longer the hands of a woman without a home, but the hands of someone who had found, slowly and without fanfare, the life she had been carrying the seeds of all along. She would think that it was exactly enough.